Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy, or the PGP, may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Dear listeners, have you heard of New York Times or the Washington Post? Probably yes. Maybe their stories on India that are often controversial here, or maybe anything under the sun because they write about practically every issue. But it is unlikely that few weeks back, you would have heard of a publication called The Atlantic, or maybe its editor, Jeffrey Goldberg. But as fate would have it, the who's who of national security elite in the United States, including the defense secretary, national security advisor, and so on, created a signal chat room to discuss or plan strikes on Houthis in Yemen. And they accidentally added Jeffrey Goldberg to that chat, making him privy to the war timeline or war plans as is being contested. And then and they didn't realize it for weeks, right? And then Jeffrey Goldberg, after a point, exited the chat and wrote about it in Atlantic, and this story broke the internet and has been hotly debated in US political circles since. To discuss this development, what it means for Europe, what it means for Trump-France relationship, what it means for how we think of platforms to communicate sensitive information and so on, and a host of other associated issues. We have with me, and I'm Lokendra, I am a research analyst with Takshashila, and I have with me Manoj, who heads our China Studies program at Takshashila, and we also have Tannmay, who is a research intern with Takshashila. So I'll start with you, Manoj. And the premise of my question is that the multiple reports have come out that indicate this signal chat room on Houthi was not the only one. There were at least 20 on host of national security issues, it appears to me. And I'd like to start with a broader question, and then maybe we can go to more specific questions. So it appears to me that one of the reasons they may be using Signal more as a platform to do all this sensitive communication is that Signal allows you to delete and remove messages after maybe a few weeks. You can set a timer off, right? And maybe there's a larger effort in the Trump administration to ensure federal record keeping laws, right, which require you to store all federal communications, right? Maybe right from the beginning, Trump down to all who's who of the cabinet, they decided we'll flout these. We would not want to keep record of what we are doing because some of the things that they're doing are like quite controversial domestically. So is it part of a larger motivation to evade record keeping?
So I don't know if it's part of a larger motivation. That's next to impossible to say with any sort of conviction. But I think what it is that there is clearly a pattern of trying to do things differently and not necessarily relying on... you can see that within this government that there is a inherent suspicion of government and government mechanisms, bureaucracy and things like that. So it fits into that pattern of trying to do things differently and not by the conventional means. I don't think violating laws is something that is particularly very high. Sanctity of the system is not particularly very high in terms of their priorities. You can see that in terms of immigration. You have seen that in terms of record keeping. You can see that in other cases, right? The sanctity of the law is not something that's a top priority for the administration. It's gone on a war path with the judiciary, particularly the liberal elements of the judiciary. So that's, I think, it fits into that pattern. I can't really say that there is a motivation, because that will require me to provide evidence of design and thinking, which is not necessarily something that's there. What you're also seeing is that there is a desire to engage in lawfare. We're recording this the day after Liberation Day in the US, where tariffs were announced. And again, an old law was used for this purpose. Emergency laws were used for this purpose. For immigration, we've seen in 1800 law being used. So I think that there is an element of lawfare also that's going on, right? So you will see a lot of pushback from the administration on any legal criticism. They'll be happy to go as far up as they want to. And that, to me, tells you two things. Firstly, there is always a law that you want to interpret in a certain way, and you can, particularly in countries that have that long legal history. In India, the Republic of India does not have that long a legal history, but there is always a law that you can be in violation of, and there's always a law that can come to your aid. Secondly, there isn't a regard for the law, right? That said, if you listen to the testimony of the CIA director to the two committees that they spoke to in the House and the Senate, he does say that, look, this was practice even in the Biden administration.
Yeah.
The signal was used, and when I came in, it was immediately installed, and so on and so forth. So there is something about this being practice. To my mind, this was used as a matter of convenience rather than something else, right? I don't think it was a deliberate action to evade record keeping. That could be part of it, but my sense is this was a matter of convenience.
But wouldn't US government, right? And now Elon Musk is also closely working with them. And a lot of technology companies historically have worked very closely with the US government and US military, right?
Yeah.
Google has worked and Amazon has worked and so on. I find it amusing that a non-profit foundation, and they have an app called Signal app, right? And of course, they have one of the best encryption protocols in place in the world, which is also being used by WhatsApp and others. But still, wouldn't government have an in-house capability to develop and deploy a government use only app for mobile phones for government officials?
No, I'm
Adding
sure.
on to that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, why Signal, right? So definitely the government has the capability, but also I would like to hear your views on why they chose Signal in specific and not the other ton of messaging apps that are there. So I mean,
That's why my answer is that I think it's a matter of convenience. That Signal is probably something that they are already using in personal life, but also in terms of their communication with each other. And it was an extension of that, right? It's a matter of convenience, and it shows you the idea of network effects, right, rather than anything else. It's just and switching costs. It deals with those two concepts. I think it's just that, and again, often we think of malicious intent, which it's fair to think of that, but often, and particularly this particular incident tells you that often incompetence is far greater reason for things to happen than malicious intent. Can the outcome of that be damaging? Yes. But to me, this is a case of just ease of functionality, something that you already had. Switching costs are too high, is just something that you do within your immediate circle rather than something that you thought of deliberately. And that's why you didn't use other platforms, right? You used this because this was something that you were already using.
So just to maybe add on to that, so it is possible, and I'm just continuing the line of argument you're making, right? It is possible that they had a government app for mobile phones for this particular usage.
I don't know if they have a government app, but there are clearly secure communications within governments.
Sure.
Because previous governments have had similar conversations.
Sure. So they might have had apps, but they might have not found them convenient to use because of network effects. That is possible.
Yeah.
And for you, incompetence is probably a better explainer than some grand design or malintent and so on. Right?
Indeed. To me, often lots of things that governments do, incompetence is a far better explanation than malicious intent. Although I see, because of the outcome, one would, and because of the lack of trust, particularly in this administration in the US, I can see why the malicious intent argument has a very strong basis.
coming back to lawfaring, right? So they're claiming that the Biden administration did similar things when they were in power. So my question is that how much impact do you think does a person like Trump, who has little regard for the judiciary or the process of law in the country, what is his impact to his administration being so almost casual with the laws and being so comfortable with flouting them and still having the guts to, defend themselves when questioned about it?
Look, I think it's not just about Trump and his behavior. I think the issue is that the culture of hiring that this administration has engaged in has been one about political loyalty rather than background, career of service, competence, and demonstrated capability, and so on and so forth. Right? It's about political loyalty. When you are in a system which prioritizes political loyalty over competence, you are likely to have such outcomes, and you are likely to see the leader try and accommodate such outcomes as long as it does not become a political liability for the leader. So I think the people who are employed understand that. So as long as the political milieu starts to shift, the ground starts to shift against Trump from a popular polling perspective, from an electoral perspective, I don't think you will see people being concerned, right? In this case, you do see that the pushback, there is polling to tell you that a significant number of Americans, I mean, I was watching a poll the other day, which said that about 75% of Americans believe that what's happened is a serious to somewhat serious problem. That is something that will weigh on Trump, right? Because it's a direct outcome. And therefore, you will see him potentially try and throw somebody under the bus eventually. Maybe not immediately, because immediately you don't want to give into the cycle. You don't want to give into the pressure, because he has enough political capital to not give into the pressure. And once you do start to give in, it starts to become like a cascading effect. So you will see him hang on. But I'm of the view that you will see some sort of a casualty among that particular group. Probably Mike Waltz, because he was the one who added Jeffrey Goldberg into the group.
If you do see a casualty, then how will Trump reconcile his protection of Mike Waltz and whatever has happened, and then suddenly his stance switching to this was incompetence and he should be fired?
I think history tells us that Trump doesn't really care about switching his positions, and neither does his electorate. So, and look, you can manage the media cycle, right? In fact, the moment somebody is sacked, you will have enough Republican surrogates on television saying, hey, look, he's responding. He's responding to public requests, right? And so it's a responsive administration. It's an administration which takes security seriously. It's not really hard to switch the narrative, particularly when you have a core base which is readily willing to buy what you're selling. And he would not be the first person to do it. And in fact, I think it would be something of a useful message to, again, I study authoritarian regimes. China is one of them. You will see in authoritarian regimes, once the leader has substantive power, the leader tends to be okay with sacrificing people who have breached loyalty, demonstrated incompetence, or anything else, even if they may be close to the leader, because that also sends a message to everybody in the system that, look, if you assume that you're safe, and if you assume that you can do whatever you like, think again. So, and that's not necessarily it's a bad policy outcome, because then the people get quite cautious about what they do, and it can lead to some degree of policy paralysis. But it also can create an environment in which people are much more cautious about how they do certain things, right? Because you know that you can be scapegoated at any point of time. So my sense is that we should think about this and the eventual fallout that will happen, maybe not immediately, in that context. It's still early days. Let's see how the Republicans digest even some of the electoral results that have come, their loss of ground in Florida, the loss of the seat in Wisconsin, the Supreme Court seat in Wisconsin. Let's see how they digest this, and that will tell us much more about how they will actually respond.
So let me now discuss the broader aspects of this. Let's discuss some specific things that came out of the chat, right? So one of the highlights was the revelation of how the Trump administration actually thinks about Europe. Right? There's the public one where JD Vance is going to Europe and lecturing them about values, about tolerating more views and so on, and other nasty things that he said there. Then there are Trump and others who are saying that Europe should pay more for their defense, should contribute more to NATO and so on. And there's a host of things they're doing around Ukraine and not involving Europe in the negotiations with Russia and so on. But this was public, right? We didn't know up till this point what they thought of Europe privately in a space where they were sure no one else was hearing it, right? This is the first time we know that they really think of Europe as pathetic. So it's a deeply personal belief that they have. So Vance said, for instance, that he just hates bailing out Europe. And the context, listeners, is that when it comes to this area, right, where the Houthis are blocking trade, US actually has less stakes. Like, as a country has less stakes, maybe globally it has more. Europe has more stakes in the trade to pass smoothly. And the discussion was, JD Vance was, I mean, hinting at whether US should really do it right now because the stake is more for Europe. Maybe they should do it, but Europe doesn't have the capacity. It was pointed out in the chat also by others that Europe wouldn't have the capacity to do it. Their navies wouldn't have, and only we can do it, right? That was the prevailing view. And then JD once said, I hate bailing out Europe again. And then Pete responded, the defense secretary, that, this is pathetic, like Europe is pathetic, and so on. So this is a specific sort of highlight from. So
I think the first question we should ask there is that, given that Hegseth is so confident that he's the only one on this side of the planet who can, carry out an operation like that, and they've made it clear that they don't want to bail out Europe again and again, is it time for Europe to consider a military alternative to the US, or is it time for Europe to build in their own, or to invest in their own military capacity? So that is something that I think is...
So the answer to that from my mind is yes. And this is not the time. The time was 10 years ago, or probably even longer before, right? I think that it's been a long learning curve for the Europeans, that they need to build their own capacity, and particularly on a military, from the military point of view. To that extent, I think the pressure that this administration brought, even in Trump 1.0, even today, that Europe must invest more in its own security, is to me useful from a European point of view. And I think you're seeing changes, right? Since the war in Ukraine began, Germany, France, and others stepped up spending. There were challenges within Germany from a legal and policy perspective to divert funds, but those challenges with this new administration that's going to be taking over in Germany seem to have been tided over. So you are likely to see Europe continue to spend more on its defense. Whether there's the speed of that process will allow them to have enough deterrence with Russia, or whether the inter sort of friction between the European states will allow for the creation of some sort of a European security force, we'll wait and see, right? Because those are much more complicated things. But I think that will capacity increase? Yes. Whether it will be sufficient, we'll wait and see. There's already talk in Europe. The French had proposed that we could extend our nuclear security umbrella to Europe. Yeah. So I think that some of those things are happening. But the pace of that, we'll wait and see, right? To the point of, this chat informing us of the sort of deeply held beliefs within the MAGA movement about Europe. Look, my view is that the vice president in the US is somebody who sees himself as a successor of the MAGA movement after Trump. He has been articulating the ideological position of the MAGA movement, which is what he did at the Munich Security Dialogue, and which is what is something that he's partly suggesting even in this. And a lot of that has to do with this frustration with allies. But it's beyond just frustration with allies. It also has to do with Europe's liberal nature, right? So to me, he represents the ideological perspective of MAGA. That said, I think this issue of burden sharing with allies is something that is not simply ideological. It's also practical. You saw it in Trump 1.0. You've seen it even before that. And you see it not just with Europe. You also see it with the US's Asian allies. Although the message to Asian allies is very different. Yeah. Like Pete Hegseth has been on a visit to the Philippines, to Japan in the last week or so. And you've seen the message very different. You've seen the message saying, hey, look, we are partners. And
it's a more calibrated
it's a more conventional US message to its allies. And that has to do with the role of China in the Indo-Pacific.
Dynamic shifting from Russia being the opposition to China.
No, that's what I'm trying to get at. So there is one ideological wing of MAGA, which has certain perspectives on values, and those values being somewhat nativist. It's not about free speech. It's about what we value as free speech, right? It's about immigration and anti-immigration, which they see Europe being pro-immigration. It's about this idea of liberal globalism, which they see Europe as representing, even Canada is representing. So it's that, right? So it's not just burden sharing with allies. It's that, right? J.D. Vance's speech in Munich was not about you Europeans need to spend more on security. It was like you Europeans need to change culturally, just like America is changing culturally through MAGA. So the burden sharing bit is to me a more realpolitik, realist approach. The cultural bit that JD Vance has been articulating is a MAGA based approach, or the extreme revolutionary groups of MAGA. And then there is this sort of
Tech
third piece, which is
Elon Musk led tech,
which is the
yeah.
tech piece,
Yeah.
which is not necessarily against globalism per se, but has its issues with it, particularly because
Regulation.
they're worried about regulation,
Yeah.
and they're worried about tax policies in Europe and other places. And then you've got this fourth piece, which is that we want to shift our focus away from issues in Europe towards the Indo-Pacific, and we want to shift our attention there. But can you do that by alienating conventional allies? Is, to me, that's where the policy sort of falls flat. So to me, what the chat explains is that you can see that dichotomy, right? Where Pete Hegseth is essentially pushing back and saying, hey, look, we're the only ones who can do this.
Yeah.
We need to demonstrate this capability. As much as I may not like the Europeans, we need to demonstrate this capability, because the demonstration of the capability has a broader global effect. In fact, Pete Hegseth makes a very conventional American strategic values argument about freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, right? Which, from a MAGA point of view, why do you care about freedom of the seas, particularly when your trade is not passing through, right? That's a very transactional approach. So to me, what the chat reveals is that there is this internal dichotomy between the values of the coalition that Trump is ruling. It's not a monolith. There are different dimensions to it. And you see that dichotomy play out in this. And you also see compromise play out in this, where Vance eventually gives in and says, yes, okay, fine, we must go ahead. Or, this is my issue, but I'm happy if the group wants to go ahead.
On a tangential note, right, you spoke about this conflict, contradiction, and a coalition and having different ideas, right? JD Vance recently gave a speech, I think, Enterprise Institute, something where he tried to reconcile the two major forces, the MAGA forces and the techno-optimist, the utopian forces, right? Which both are part of this coalition. One is Elon Musk and MAGA is Trump, right? So they're ruling together, but they're very contradictory. So I think, yes, and your analysis on the four sort of threats that have come together on Europe, right? I think that is spot on.
That speech that you refer to is quite interesting, right? Because in that, and I heard the whole speech, it's about a 25-minute speech, and only the last 10 minutes are really interesting. The first 15 of it is him essentially vamping. He makes 4 points, right? He makes 4 policy proposals for, and what he talks about is that, look, there is an argument that people are making that there is an inconsistency in our approach, because at one level we are talking about populism, which is about job creation, supporting the American economy, supporting American labor, and so on and so forth. And at the other level, we're working with these tech optimists, Silicon Valley folks, to try and craft out a future on technology. And the impact of growth of technology will hurt the populist narrative because of labor. And he tried to reconcile those. And his reconciliation was this: 4 points. First was erect a tariff wall to attract investment. Second, crack down on immigration so that enterprises don't use cheap labor. Right? That was his essential reason for cracking down on immigration. It was not a cultural reason. It was not crime. It was so that enterprises don't use cheap labor, because for him, the impact of globalization has fundamentally been that enterprises have chased cheap labor in other markets, which has hurt American jobs. His third point was cheaper input costs. And so how will government support these companies which will make in America? By cheaper input costs, by trying to reduce environmental regulation and trying to lower energy costs. And finally, they will try and make the 2017 tax cuts permanent, particularly tax cuts on capital rather than financial capital, not just land labor, right? Tax cuts on that sort of capital investment. So to me, it's an inconsistent agenda, right? There is this inherent flaw at the heart of the idea of promoting jobs, and because you will have to upskill people and supporting technology. And I think that there is a tension at the heart of this agenda that exists. And Vance is trying to thread the needle with this proposal. I don't think it works. I don't think it works because you're also assuming that other countries are not going to retaliate to your economic plans. They will retaliate to your economic plans. So I think that there is an inconsistency at the heart of this agenda, and holding this coalition together is going to be challenging.
I think one central thread also was elevating labor through technology, right? US labor through technology. I think he was trying to sell that technology utopia to MAGA folks also,
Yeah, the idea of upskilling labor through technology.
or elevating labor, or
How would you elevate labor? You would elevate. So, for example, I, as a researcher today, have access to Chat GPT, which can help me do my research that I otherwise took a week to do within 3 hours. Right. So, my productivity does go up. Yes, but in many other ways, it can also make me obsolete. So, after 2 years of my productivity going up, I can also become fairly easily obsolete. So this tension is likely to remain. And the argument that I'm making is not of a Luddite argument that we should not adopt technology, but to assume that as technology advances, it will not replace certain kinds of jobs or make certain kinds of jobs obsolete, which will require people to identify new kinds of jobs. And jobs are not just about income, they're also about purpose. To be able to reconcile all of that, I think that this assumption, and this is not new. I remember Barack Obama or even Bill Clinton trying to bring change and talking about how we need to skill people to adapt to the new economy and the new types of jobs. It's not happened, or it's happened at a scale where you've not been able to create sufficient jobs which create purpose. So it's challenging, and it's likely to be challenging. So I don't buy the techno utopia argument. At least I don't. But I'd like to see how they thread this needle.
Coming back to Vance's second point, right? That's on immigration. Talent immigration is something that is like at the heart of this divide, because fundamentally the tech elite want greater H-1B access so that they can get the cream of the talent, while MAGA folks are going absolutely against more people coming in and taking their jobs, right? So I think this is the dichotomy we have seen play out, with Trump supporting the tech elite over the MAGA folks. And I would like to know, what are your views on how this will continue to play out, given that Vance is saying now that they want to reduce immigration, or they want to crack down on immigration, especially talent immigration?
We'll see whether they actually crack down on that. They backed off initially when they initially were talking, when Vivek Ramaswamy was talking about, when that friction happened with him, they did back off. I don't think Silicon Valley wants high-skilled immigrants to go away. To me, the bigger challenge for the United States is not this. The bigger challenge for the United States is what the Department of Government Efficiency is doing. It is systematically reducing opportunities for high-skilled research work, whether it's in the hard sciences, whether it's in industrial sciences, whether it's in certain areas of technology, whether it's in biology, physics, all those areas. This attitude essentially creates a whole bunch of really highly skilled people who don't have opportunities elsewhere. And so they are likely to try and move to other parts of the world, which undermines America's strength. So to me, the actions that department is taking are the bigger challenge. It's not difficult for the United States to, and I think it would be smart, right? Trump in his campaign had said, hey, look, I want a program where if you come and study a master's here or a PhD here or whatever in particular kinds of subjects, you immediately get access to a green card. He's not doing that right now. But you can easily pivot to that, right? Say that we want the cream of the crop to come here. So you can actually end up in that sort of an environment, and you will find buy-in from Musk and others. While you can continue to crack down on minority groups, so-called Venezuelan gangs or other elements, right? You can continue to do that sort of crackdown, for which you will get a fair amount of popular cred. So I think that's where you will end up seeing things go, where the crackdowns will be on low-skilled labor. High-skilled labor continues to get attracted, or at least America remains open to high-skilled labor. Whether that high-skilled labor goes there or not is something that we will see, because that also depends on culture. If the culture becomes such where, because you are another country's citizen and, you make a political comment on X and you get deported, that sort of stuff then deters people from going, right? I mean, what's the difference of going to the United States and going to China then?
Yeah.
Right? So, and at least in China, you don't go with the expectation of free speech.
Sure.
Right? In the US, you go with the expectation of free speech, and that's therefore far more damaging. So I think that those are bigger challenges.
Manoj, at this point, I think I like to reorient the discussion back to Signal, because we went from Signal to grand politics issues in the United States, right? So just coming back to the Signal chat, and we spoke about Europe, right? The highlight. Another highlight for me was that Vance has been towing Trump's line since he's become vice president. And that is natural, right? Because, see, Vance was just a senator from Ohio. And I think Musk and other tech bros pumped in a lot of money and lobbying and eventually made Trump choose Vance over others because this is a long term future with Vance, maybe someday becoming president and so on. So, Vance is their guy right there. And Vance has been very careful with his speeches, right? What he speaks, how he reconciles different contradictions, for instance, and so on. This is the first time that publicly, I think, we are coming to know about a disagreement Vance has with Trump, or where Vance thinks the president doesn't have the right view or something. So what he says is, and I quote, "I'm not sure the president is aware how inconsistent this is with his message on Europe right now," unquote. Right. So, what do you make of this?
I mean, you can read it as criticism, you can read it as difference of opinion, you can also read it as drawing on Trump's authority to make the case that, hey, look, but your broader agenda is that you want the Europeans to act, and this undermines that agenda. So you can read it as a conversation. I don't necessarily read it as a huge political divide between them. I read it as Vance essentially making the case with regard to the portfolio on foreign affairs that he's dealing with, right? He's been the one who's taken the charge against the Europeans predominantly. And like I said, that's partly to do with him wanting to, he might genuinely believe what he's saying, although that's difficult to say given a few years ago he was calling Trump all sorts of names. So who knows what he genuinely believes.
Yeah.
But he does see this as an opportunity politically to build up his MAGA credentials.
Yeah.
So to me, it's in line with that. Rather, I don't necessarily read it as something where he's breaking with Trump.
Sure.
Or he's contradicting Trump. In fact, what he's saying is that, hey, look, this set of actions is inconsistent with our actual policy orientation with regard to Europe, and it can undermine that policy orientation. And that's a strategic orientation for us, right? We need to get the Europeans to do more so that we can walk away from the European theater and focus on the Indo-Pacific theater, and also so that we can undermine these globalists, right? So I read it as in that context.
Tannmay, so you have pursued the chat, right?
Yeah.
The first tranche that the Atlantic had push out, and then another one that they're formally redacted, then the war timeline,
Yeah.
the bombing timeline, right? So apart from Europe and what we just spoke on, the Vance Trump thing, did you find any other highlight that stood out for you at the chat?
I think more than the chat, the way that Hexeth and the entire group has tried to, say at the same time that, hey, this is not classified information, but we're also doing a great job, and this is also important things. They're pushing so many diverging narratives around this thing, right? And they're trying to say that we didn't share any war details, we didn't share this, we didn't share any specific location details, targets,
yeah.
and so therefore this cannot be counted as classified information. And so that entire divergence in narrative is, I think, that's something very interesting.
So they're playing a semantics battle, right? What is sensitive, what is classified, what is declassified, who is the declassifying authority, what platforms, and so on. But do you think they'll get away with this?
I think that's a really tough call to make, right? Because first of all, your prosecution has to come from the government, your investigation has to come from the government. Even if it does, then the broader question is, does Trump really, at the end of the day, Trump and his administration by and large, even if the judiciary takes a call on this, are they going to strictly abide with what they say, given the tussles we've seen?
Manoj, the Senate Intelligence Committee, right? That's a historically powerful committee. They can summon anyone. They can also hold classified briefings and so on. Do you think they are in a position to take action?
Look, they can't sack anybody.
Okay.
Right? They can't sack anybody. At the end of the day, it's the Justice Department which will have to act. I presume, I don't know enough, but I presume that US courts can take suo motu notice of certain things happening and initiate some sort of an investigation. But I don't know if that's the law in the United States. My understanding is that the Justice Department has to act. And I don't think there is any reason for this Justice Department to act. I mean, Trump is a president after a long time who's gone to the Justice Department and delivered a deeply political speech. So, and he sees it as an instrument of his executive branch, right? So I don't think that you will see legal action. Although I do think that there is a political cost, and therefore you will see at least somebody, most likely Mike Waltz, facing the axe down the road. Maybe not immediately. Particularly as more information comes out, right? Like we began this conversation with you saying that there has been reportage of more chats on Signal that have come out. So that could be, it's setting the stage for somebody's head to roll, and it most likely seems like it'll be Mike Waltz's head to roll.
Okay.
In terms of the semantic jugglery of, classified, not classified, war plan, battle plan, attack plan, whatever, to me, all that's honestly flooding the zone with bullshit. Because at the end of the day, all one needs to think of is, prior to that action taking place, if that information was available with an adversary, would that be seen as a leak, which is a national security risk? Which would that put Americans in harm? Forget Americans, right? Predominantly our listeners here are Indians. If you assume that this sort of information about the timing of when planes will take off and bombs will drop is available a few hours before to an adversary, let's say Pakistan, before the Indian administration takes some action, the Balakot strikes or things like that, would it be seen as a breach that is affecting national security? Would it be seen as a breach of secrets? I would assume yes. Would your adversary be thrilled to have such information? And would it augment your adversary's capability to deter or to punish you from taking that action? I would assume yes. So I think if you just cut all the nonsense about war, battle, this, that, timing, targets, whatever, is that information that is something that can fundamentally undermine that course of action that you're going to take? And would your adversary be much better off to potentially inflict costs on you? Yes. And I think that's all that matters. Whether it is classified or not classified, who has the authority to classify, is things for the courts to decide. I mean, in the committee hearings that you had Tulsi Gabbard and you had, CIA director sitting, neither of them would acknowledge that we will take a call on classification, which to me was absurd. I mean, she's a director of national intelligence.
Yeah.
She has a call on classification also. So I think that some of this, yes, legally, if it goes to the courts, you'll see it get settled in one way or the other. But it's not surprising that they've made these arguments, right? I mean, when Trump was charged, when he was in the last few years, when he was an ex-president and he was charged with a case of classified documents. The argument that they made was like, well, look, he was a president. If he thinks it's classified, it's classified. So, you can see bullshit arguments being made in public domain. But in the courts, these answers of whether it is classified or not classified is a matter for the law to answer, right? What's said in the public domain can be very different from what's said in courts. Right? So if it goes to the courts, you will get some of these answers. But until that happens, or if that even happens, as an ordinary, normal thinking individual, if you just think of whether this information is sensitive and a risk and its leakage a risk to national security, your answer will be yes. Whether it is a additional risk to national security that you had a person who was not supposed to be in the group, who is not in government, as part of the group accessing all this information, yes.
So, Manoj, you touched upon the idea that if an adversary got access to, maybe through hacking or through other means, to these chats,
or if they get added to a Signal chat,
or if they added to, So Signal might be one of the safest chat commercially available communication platform in the world, right? But still, I mean, research has shown. I mean, there is a 2021 paper that showed that the multi-device feature that they have, right, that can be compromised, that has some faults. And very recently, Pentagon released a sort of advisory or warning about Signal, saying that that linked device feature is problematic, right? So it seems that maybe even the choice of the platform maybe was not that.
Well, and then adding on to that, right? So Trump will come and say that the Pentagon was the Biden's Pentagon. So I mean, it was during the Biden administration. He'll
No,
say
this
something.
this is recent.
Yeah, this was 2023. But the fact of the matter is, in Feb 2024, the National Security Agency of Trump's administration has come out and released a report just like a few days before this has happened, saying that Signal is not to be used for any government communication whatsoever. I think that's a really
It's not just about Signal. It's also about using your personal cell phones,
Yeah.
right, which are easily hackable compared to. So at the end of the day, look, at any point of time, the argument that this was a smart thing to do is, or this was convention in governments to do this, particularly on sensitive matters like this, is flawed. The bigger challenge is, that's one part of the piece. The bigger issue is that you had on this platform somebody who's not part of the government listening in and watching in, and you had no idea.
Yeah.
Right? That to me is the bigger piece.
So no one was vetting, no one was monitoring.
You were not.
Yeah.
You were all there at the highest levels of government, of the executive, and you were unable to see that there was somebody who was not supposed to be there.
And that to a term critic, right?
Now, adding on to that, right? So this is a little bit speculative, but I am curious. I'm curious to know what you think about how Mike Waltz added Jeffrey Goldberg in the first place. Because so Jeffrey Goldberg has come out and said since then that he has never ever spoken to Mike Waltz in his life. There has been no interaction with him. And Jeffrey Goldberg says himself that he has no idea how Mike Waltz got his number to add to the Signal group chat. Right. So this is of course a little bit of speculation, but
are you hinting at the idea that there were some forces at work?
Again, so this is a lot of speculation.
Because they're investigating how he got added.
This is a very strong message to Europe, right? And this is one way to send it if you think about it that way.
Again, I think that as much as, I began my responses to some of these questions saying that, often we attribute maliciousness to incompetence. Often we also attribute deep strategic thought to incompetence. So I think both of those things work. Right? So I don't think there is some deep strategic thought here about sending a message. I think
so it's sloppiness, not
it
thought.
is sloppiness.
Yeah.
It is incompetence. I also don't think that Mike Waltz and Jeffrey Goldberg have never spoken. You don't necessarily just have somebody's number. Maybe you do, right? He's the editor of The Atlantic, so maybe you do have the number. I have no reason to doubt Jeffrey Goldberg if he's saying that he's not interacted with Mike Waltz, right? Fair enough. I don't no reason to doubt him, but I'd be very surprised that there's been no interaction. How he added him, again, he knows best, and he's obviously struggled to explain it when he's gone on primetime news. He's the best person to explain how, he added somebody who was not supposed to be in the group. But to me, fundamentally, it tells you that convenience cannot trump security. Security requires you to take certain kinds of actions, particularly in a world where access to information is being sought after by your adversaries who are technologically very, very competent. Your adversaries are not some incompetent goofs. So you need to be much more secure. And such discussions need to not happen on such platforms.
Manoj,
I think that's the takeaway.
So one final question before we close this conversation, and this is to both of you, Tannmay and Manoj, right? Just maybe a brief 1-2 line answer. Why should listeners or tuning in from India right now care about this development? Why it should matter to Indian listeners? Any 1 or 2 points? If you have.
I think the first point is that, intelligence sharing and security of that is important. India and the US are also close partners. So it's important for us in that sense. Secondly, historically, the US has been the benchmark and the yardstick for security when it comes to such issues. If that benchmark and yardstick start to slip, there can be cultural downstream effects in other agencies also, which is not something that we desire. And thirdly and finally, I think why it is important is for the broader reason that you should not let your partisan preferences blind you to obvious incompetence. And that is something that's valuable for any democracy to keep in mind. And India is a democracy where people should keep in mind that you should not let your partisan biases blind you to obvious incompetence that is in front of you. And you should therefore ask some of those questions and not believe in hashtag masterstrokes and, WhatsApp forwards.
Tannmay?
I completely agree with what he said, right? So firstly, I find it really surprising that there is not a greater Republican fallout about this. And adding on to Manoj's third point, if something like this does happen in India, then it is something that we should, of course, forgo our partisan differences and come together to criticize and to make sure things like this don't happen. Other than that, I think in general, it gives us a more authentic view into the administration's view on Europe, as we've discussed. And I think that's a valuable insight for us as Indians that, yeah, the US is fundamentally restructuring the way they think about alliances, the way they think about Europe, and the way they think about the Indo-Pacific, right? So I think we've known this, but now we have concrete evidence of this is what they think on a personal level as well.
I think that's an excellent way to end this conversation. Both of your points are really good. So thank you everyone for tuning in. If you have any thoughts, any contrary perspectives, feel free to write to us and we'll be happy to hear them out. Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.